Friends, thank you for being here today. Let me ask you a question. What would you think if the most powerful man in the world tried to convince one of his closest allies to give up its independence? Not through war, not through invasion, but through persuasion, a sales pitch disguised as diplomacy. That's not a hypothetical. It happened. Behind closed doors, Washington floated an idea so bizarre it almost sounded like satire. What if Canada simply joined the United States? The offer was framed as a strategic opportunity. Become the 51st state, they said, and in return, America would extend the Golden Dome missile defense system for free. The message was clear: surrender sovereignty, and you'll get safety. But this wasn't about missiles. It was about control, about power, about a country so obsessed with dominance that it has started turning its friends into targets. And the timing couldn't have been worse. As Washington's trade war crumbled, as new tariffs on pharmaceuticals, heavy trucks, and everyday goods began strangling its own economy, desperation crept in. The old illusion of America first was falling apart. And when power begins to slip, those addicted to it reach for ever more extreme ways to hold on. The idea of annexing Canada, America's closest ally, trading partner, and neighbor, was not just reckless. It was revealing. It showed a government so consumed by its own image that it mistook intimidation for leadership. So today, we need to unpack what this obsession with power really means, not just for politics, but for the American economy, its diplomacy, and its identity on the world stage. Because this is not simply about one outrageous proposal. It's about a pattern, the slow corrosion of credibility that happens when arrogance replaces strategy. How does a superpower begin to lose its grip, not through defeat, but through delusion? And as we'll see, while Washington was busy dreaming of annexation, Canada was quietly crafting a strategy that may define the next century. Power rarely unravels in silence. It collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. And this latest episode, this strange 51st state fantasy, didn't emerge from strength. It emerged from desperation. You see, Washington's economy is no longer what it pretends to be. Behind the patriotic slogans and booming stock tickers lies a dangerous truth. The very policies meant to restore American greatness are now eating away at its foundation. In the last year alone, new tariffs were slapped on pharmaceutical drugs, kitchen appliances, heavy trucks, you name it. The justification was protection. The result was inflation. Factories dependent on imported components saw costs soar. Pharmaceutical distributors scrambled as supply chains buckled. Families paid more for the same goods. And American exporters, the same ones told they'd win big from these policies, began losing markets at record speed. That's the irony no one in power wanted to admit. The so-called trade war was supposed to humble foreign competitors. Instead, it humiliated American producers. And as revenues began to collapse, the government turned to its oldest habit, borrowing. The debt ballooned, confidence wavered, and for the first time in decades, foreign partners began quietly diversifying away from the U.S. market. In that moment, the leadership in Washington did what it always does when cornered. It looked for distraction, a new, big idea to reassert dominance, a statement so bold that it might drown out the growing noise of economic panic. And so came the outrageous proposition: Canada should join us. But that wasn't strategy. That was theater, a power move born out of insecurity. Because the truth is, no serious leader proposes annexing the country that supplies your largest trade surplus when their own economy is crumbling. It's like setting your own lifeboat on fire just to feel powerful again. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, something remarkable was happening. Instead of reacting with outrage, Canadian leadership saw the move for what it was, a sign of weakness. And under the calm, steady hand of Prime Minister Mark Carney, they began quietly shaping a very different response, one rooted not in anger, but in precision. And that's where this story begins to turn, from bluster in Washington to strategy in Ottawa. Because while the US was busy flexing, Canada was preparing to outthink it. So let's look at what Carney did next, and how one man's economic discipline managed to turn America's arrogance into Canada's opportunity. While Washington descended into posturing and chaos, something extraordinary was happening north of the border. Canadians, often seen as polite, patient, and predictable, were quietly preparing one of the most effective economic counterpunches in modern history. This wasn't a government decree or a fiery political campaign. It began in grocery aisles, airports, and online shopping carts. Ordinary citizens simply made a choice: buy Canadian, travel local, spend at home. It was a rebellion conducted not with protests or sanctions, but with silence and restraint. Because when diplomacy fails, money speaks. Polling data soon revealed a level of unity rarely seen in any democracy. Over 90% of Canadians supported reducing reliance on the US economy. That's not politics, that's national purpose. For the first time in generations, Canadians weren't looking south for opportunity. They were looking inward toward themselves and outward toward new partners across the world. At the center of this transformation stood Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man whose calm, deliberate approach was the exact opposite of Washington's erratic theatrics. Carney understood what few in the US seemed to grasp: that real power isn't declared in press conferences. It's built through credibility, trust, and consistency. So while the US was firing off tariffs and tantrums, Carney was mobilizing the provinces, rallying business leaders, and creating a unified economic strategy. His message was simple but devastatingly effective. If they treat us like a pawn, we'll play like a rival. Within months, Canadian border traffic dropped by 34%. By August, air travel to the US collapsed by 25%. Tens of thousands of trips cancelled. Millions in spending vanished. This wasn't random. It was a coordinated signal to Washington. Respect is not optional. And as American industries began to feel the pain, from hotel chains and Broadway theaters to cross-border retailers, Carney never once raised his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers were speaking for him. It's one thing to face opposition from a foreign adversary. It's another to lose the loyalty of your closest ally, the one that fought beside you, traded beside you, and believed in you. And yet that's exactly what happened. What came next would turn this quiet resistance into a full-blown economic reckoning. Because as Canada stood firm, Washington's arrogance only deepened. And that's where the collapse began to spread. In moments of crisis, some leaders shout, others plan. Mark Carney planned. While Washington's leadership tried to bully its way through collapsing trade talks and rising tariffs, Carney chose something far more devastating: composure. He understood that power built on noise collapses under silence. And so, while others tweeted threats, he picked up the phone. While others made headlines, he made deals. When the US president floated the idea of annexation, that absurd 51st state proposal, Carney's answer was measured, deliberate, unforgettable. 5 firm nevers. Never in our history, never in our future, never under our flag, never under your rule, never under your shadow. That single phrase did more to rally the Canadian people than any slogan or campaign could. It wasn't anger. It was resolve, the kind that turns national frustration into national strength. Behind the scenes, Carney worked to solidify alliances. He reached out to European and Asian partners, pushing for trade diversification deals. He launched initiatives that redirected Canadian exports away from American dependency and toward emerging markets. The result was a foreign policy realignment so subtle that Washington barely noticed, until the consequences began hitting home. Tourism dollars stopped flowing. Border towns quieted. Factories that relied on Canadian demand began to shutter. And through it all, Carney never taunted, never gloated. He simply kept moving, step by step, like a chess grandmaster guiding his pieces into perfect position, while his opponent mistook bravado for strategy. But what made Carney's response so brilliant wasn't just the economics. It was psychological. He understood that Washington's leadership couldn't handle being ignored. They thrived on outrage, confrontation, headlines. So Carney denied them all three. No public insults, no fiery statements, just economic gravity doing its work. Within months, the effects were unmistakable. A 33% collapse in Canadian tourism to the U.S., 7 million fewer visits, billions in lost revenue, tens of thousands of American jobs gone, border retailers cutting staff, duty-free shops losing 80% of their business. In moments of crisis, some leaders shout, others plan. Mark Carney planned. While Washington's leadership tried to bully its way through collapsing trade talks and rising tariffs, Carney chose something far more devastating: composure. He understood that power built on noise collapses under silence. And so, while others tweeted threats, he picked up the phone. While others made headlines, he made deals. When the U.S. president floated the idea of annexation, that absurd 51st state proposal, Carney's answer was measured, deliberate, unforgettable. 5 firm nevers. Never in our history, never in our future, never under our flag, never under your rule, never under your shadow. That single phrase did more to rally the Canadian people than any slogan or campaign could. It wasn't anger. It was resolve, the kind that turns national frustration into national strength. Behind the scenes, Carney worked to solidify alliances. He reached out to European and Asian partners, pushing for trade diversification deals. He launched initiatives that redirected Canadian exports away from American dependency and toward emerging markets. The result was a foreign policy realignment so subtle that Washington barely noticed, until the consequences began hitting home. Tourism dollars stopped flowing. Border towns quieted. Factories that relied on Canadian demand began to shutter. And through it all, Carney never taunted, never gloated. He simply kept moving, step by step, like a chess grandmaster guiding his pieces into perfect position, while his opponent mistook bravado for strategy. But what made Carney's response so brilliant wasn't just the economics, it was psychological. He understood that Washington's leadership couldn't handle being ignored. They thrived on outrage, confrontation, headlines. So Carney denied them all three. No public insults, no fiery statements, just economic gravity doing its work. Within months, the effects were unmistakable. A 33% collapse in Canadian tourism to the U.S., 7 million fewer visits, billions in lost revenue, tens of thousands of American jobs gone, border retailers cutting staff, duty-free shops losing 80% of their business. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It was a quiet revolution, a test of which country could think strategically rather than react emotionally. And it was becoming increasingly clear Carney was winning that test. Because as he fortified Canada's economy with partnerships and pragmatism, Washington was doing the opposite, alienating allies, contradicting its own diplomats, and broadcasting to the world that it no longer knew how to lead. As Canada's strategy unfolded quietly, something very different was happening south of the border: disorder, contradiction, denial. It began, as these things often do, with one careless remark. The president stood before cameras and once again repeated the idea that Canada could benefit from becoming the 51st state. For weeks, his aides scrambled to explain it away, saying it was a joke, a misunderstanding, a metaphor. But the damage was done. In Ottawa, it confirmed what many already suspected, that Washington had stopped seeing Canada as a partner and started viewing it as a possession. What followed was bureaucratic chaos. Within days, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, publicly contradicted his own president, calling the 51st state notion a thing of the past. His statement was supposed to calm nerves. Instead, it exposed the truth, that the American government couldn't even agree with itself. Reporters noticed, allies noticed, investors noticed, and as the White House tried to project confidence, its tone grew defensive, erratic. Trade representatives gave contradictory briefings, and key Republican governors were forced into damage control missions of their own. One of them, Louisiana's Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser, traveled personally to Canada, embarrassed by the president's comments. He offered apologies no one in Washington had the humility to give. He admitted, on record, that Canadian tourists were his state's lifeline and that his own party's leader was driving them away. "I had to go there," he said, "because silence was costing us jobs." That sentence, "silence was costing us jobs," became the quiet indictment of an entire administration. Across the U.S., governors and local officials began to panic. Florida's theme parks cut hours. Hotels around Times Square closed floors. Michigan's casinos dimmed their lights to save electricity because there were no Canadian players left to fill the tables. The travel collapse was spreading like a contagion, and the federal government had no plan to stop it. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Carney didn't need to say a word. His composure and the measured calm of a man watching the world's largest economy trip over its own arrogance spoke volumes. The contrast was now impossible to ignore. A Canada that moved with precision and purpose, an America adrift in contradiction and confusion. And yet, what was unfolding wasn't just a trade crisis or a diplomatic spat. It was the beginning of something much larger, because when a superpower loses its grip on unity, when arrogance turns inward, the fallout doesn't stop at the border. It spreads into every factory, every paycheck, every promise made to working Americans who now wonder how their leaders let it all slip away. While Washington stumbled over its own rhetoric, Ottawa was quietly redrawing the map. Not the kind you hang on a classroom wall, but the one that decides who trades with whom, who holds leverage, and who shapes the future. Mark Carney understood something fundamental. When a nation's neighbor becomes unpredictable, stability becomes your greatest weapon. And so, while the White House blustered about America First, Canada began executing Canada Secure. In just months, Carney launched a three-pillar plan that redefined Canada's economic direction. The first pillar, diversify trade away from the United States. Canada deepened ties with the European Union through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, expanded Pacific partnerships under the CPTPP, and opened new energy and tech corridors with Japan, South Korea, and India. Each of these moves sent a quiet but unmistakable message. Canada would no longer be held hostage by U.S. policy swings. The second pillar, strengthen domestic industries. Billions were redirected into renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, and homegrown steel, including the now famous $400 million relief loan to Aloma Steel, a decision both patriotic and symbolic. Critics tried to frame it as interventionist. Carney called it insurance for sovereignty. The message resonated with ordinary Canadians. When the world feels unstable, build at home. And the third pillar, rebuild trust abroad. Where Washington threatened tariffs, Ottawa offered treaties. Where U.S. diplomats scolded allies, Canada invited cooperation. Within a year, Carney had secured bilateral agreements with Latin America and quietly positioned Canada as a reliable intermediary between Europe and Asia, a bridge nation in a world fractured by ego and excess. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement wasn't economic at all. It was psychological. For decades, Canadians measured their economy by proximity to America's. Now, polling showed something extraordinary. 91% of Canadians supported reducing reliance on the United States. That's not just consensus. That's a generational shift. Canada was no longer reacting to its neighbors' behavior. It was defining its own destiny. And ironically, it was the arrogance from Washington that made that unity possible. Carney's calm discipline stood in stark contrast to the impulsive improvisation across the border, one leader speaking in complete sentences while the other fired slogans into the void, one building long-term alliances, the other dismantling them for applause. Even U.S. economists began to take notice. They warned that 36 states depend on Canadian trade as their number one export lifeline, from auto parts in Michigan to lumber in Oregon. grain in the Midwest, and tourism in the South. By severing trust, the administration had not only fractured diplomacy, but threatened the daily flow of goods that fed millions of American jobs. And yet, Carney never gloated. His approach remained steady, a quiet reminder that restraint can often be the most powerful form of leadership. The result? Canada was stepping out of America's shadow, not through confrontation, but through competence. But as the North found its footing, the cracks in the American system deepened. The question now wasn't whether Canada could survive without America. It was whether America could survive the consequences of its own hubris. As Canada rose with quiet precision, the U.S. began to unravel under the weight of its own contradictions. What started as a bold promise to restore greatness had curdled into something darker, a political obsession that treated diplomacy like a zero-sum game and economics like a battlefield. Across America's heartland, that obsession has left real scars. Entire industries, from steel to manufacturing, from agriculture to tourism, now operate under uncertainty. One executive from the U.S. Travel Association warned months ago that even a 10% decline in Canadian tourism could erase $2 billion in revenue and 14,000 jobs. The administration didn't just ignore that warning, it managed to triple the damage. By mid-2025, border traffic from Canada had fallen 34%. Airlines reported a 25% plunge in passenger volume from Canadian cities. Hotel workers in border states saw their hours cut in half. Duty-free shops, once bustling with weekend travelers, now sat deserted, their windows covered in "closed for renovation" signs that everyone knew were lies. In Michigan, casinos that once hummed with cross-border energy have gone quiet. Slots turned off to save power, restaurants closing early, and outlet malls near the Ambassador Bridge left echoing with emptiness. In Florida, hotels near Disney shuttered entire floors. In New York, Broadway producers cut shows short, unable to fill seats once reserved by visitors from Ontario and Quebec. It isn't a storm that swept through once and left. It's a slow, grinding decay, the kind that eats away at confidence, at pride, at the belief that tomorrow will be better. And the damage isn't only economic, it's cultural. For decades, Canadians felt a sense of warmth toward their southern neighbor, a feeling built on shared wars, shared borders, shared dreams. But when a leader begins to mock an ally's sovereignty, when they suggest annexation or issue tariffs that feel like punishments, that warmth curdles into something colder. The phrase "America First" was meant to inspire pride. Instead, it now echoes as a warning that power, when wielded without humility, can turn inward and destroy the very system it seeks to defend. What began as a trade dispute has become something deeper, a moral collapse. The United States once led by example. Now it struggles to lead even by influence. The world sees an America that bullies its allies and blames its rivals. Meanwhile, the economy, supposedly the crown jewel of strength, trembles under the strain. Inflation remains stubborn, exports are shrinking, and confidence among foreign investors is eroding. Even small businesses, the backbone of every American town, now face higher costs for imported materials and dwindling customers from abroad. And through it all, the obsession with control continues, the refusal to admit mistakes, the insistence that everything is going according to plan. But when the plan costs jobs, trust, and alliances, is it still leadership? Or is it self-destruction dressed as strength? The truth is, America's greatest enemy was never a rival nation. It was pride, unchecked, unexamined, and unwilling to listen. Because when power becomes poison, even the mightiest empire begins to rot from within. As America turns inward, the rest of the world is moving on. Quietly, methodically, without the fanfare of sanctions or military build-ups, allies once dependent on Washington's leadership are beginning to chart their own course. And Canada stands at the forefront of that transformation. While the US bickers over tariffs and border control, Canada has been busy redrawing the global map of trade and diplomacy. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ottawa has signed new strategic agreements with Europe, expanded cooperation with India, and deepened economic ties with Asia and Latin America. These moves aren't acts of rebellion, they are acts of adaptation. When your biggest partner becomes unpredictable, you build a world that doesn't depend on them. Carney understood something Washington refused to see. In today's interconnected world, power isn't about how loud you shout. It's about how many people still want to listen. As Canada strengthened its hand abroad, its economy became more resilient at home. By pivoting trade toward new partners, Canadian industries insulated themselves from the volatility of America's policies. Energy, technology, agriculture all found new markets waiting beyond the border. What used to be a relationship of dependence has evolved into one of cautious independence. The same pattern is repeating across the Western world. Germany, once deferential to U.S. trade priorities, is now partnering with Canada on clean technology and green hydrogen. Mexico, having endured tariffs and insults, is deepening its alliances in South America and Asia. Even smaller nations, Ireland, Singapore, the Netherlands, are quietly shifting their diplomatic centers of gravity away from Washington. The result? A world that no longer fears disappointing the United States, a world that has learned to operate without waiting for its permission. This isn't isolationism by accident, it's isolationism by consequence. When arrogance replaces strategy, allies stop calling, trade partners stop buying, and the illusion of dominance fades into irrelevance. Consider the symbolism. For decades, American culture and products represented aspiration. Tourists flocked to New York, entrepreneurs dreamed of Silicon Valley, and global leaders sought the White House as a stage for unity. But now, the flow is reversing. Fewer foreign students, fewer tourists, fewer investors, not because America has lost its potential, but because it has lost its humility. Meanwhile, nations like Canada are quietly winning the long game, the game of trust. In a world where uncertainty is poison, reliability becomes power, and reliability is precisely what Ottawa, Berlin, and Tokyo now offer in abundance. For the first time in modern history, the U.S. is discovering what it means to be replaceable, not through conquest or collapse, but through irrelevance. The question that remains is chilling. When your allies learn to thrive without you, how long before they decide they no longer need you at all? And yet, beneath all of this global movement lies something deeper, something human. The real story isn't just about trade or diplomacy. It's about the quiet heartbreak of a nation watching its influence fade, not because it was defeated, but because it refused to listen. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous kind of fall, the one that happens in silence. Behind the numbers, behind the headlines and diplomatic feuds, there's something far more personal, the quiet suffering of ordinary Americans who never asked to be part of this economic experiment. In towns across the Midwest, the hum of factories has gone still. Border economies that once thrived on Canadian trade are gasping for air. Hotel workers in Buffalo and Detroit are watching their shifts disappear. Restaurant servers who once welcomed tourists from Toronto and Montreal now stand before empty tables. Duty-free shop owners on the northern border say their business has collapsed by more than 80%. Imagine that for a moment, not because of war, not because of a natural disaster, but because of arrogance. Because one administration decided that insulting allies and waging tariff wars was somehow a show of strength. The pain isn't abstract anymore. It's in the families skipping grocery bills to pay rent. It's in the young people leaving small towns because there are no jobs left. It's in the retirees who spent decades saving for a future that inflation is now devouring. And in places like New York, the cultural capital of America, the shock is just as visible. Tourism from Canada has fallen sharply. Broadway seats sit empty, hotel floors in Times Square are closed off, and restaurants once filled with international visitors now rely on discounts to survive. The city that never sleeps is learning what quiet really sounds like. Meanwhile, in Florida, the story repeats. Theme parks are cutting hours. Coastal resorts are dimming their lights. And entire communities built around seasonal visitors from Canada are fighting to stay afloat. One hotel owner recently said, "It's like someone just turned off the tap overnight." Everywhere you look, the same pattern emerges. Fewer visitors, fewer dollars, fewer opportunities. What was once a thriving ecosystem of cross-border commerce is now shrinking into survival mode. And yet, those at the top call this strength. They call it independence. They call it putting America first. But ask the small-town shop owner in Michigan who just closed her doors for the last time if she feels first. Ask the airport worker in Florida who lost his job when flights were canceled if this feels like victory. The irony is brutal. The people who were promised prosperity have been handed pain. The workers who were told they'd be protected have been left exposed. And the allies who were supposed to stand beside America are now standing apart from it. Because when leadership becomes an obsession with control, the cost is always paid by those who have none. And so the question becomes, how much longer can a nation run on pride when its people are running out of patience? In the end, this story isn't just about trade or tariffs, or even about one leader's feud with Canada. It's about the deeper unraveling of a system built on arrogance, a system so convinced of its own dominance that it forgot how fragile power really is. Result HNA. For decades, America's strength didn't come from bullying others. It came from collaboration, trust, and the belief that prosperity could be shared. The US and Canada once stood as a model of partnership. Two nations so economically intertwined that each success was mutual. Factories thrived on both sides of the border, supply chains worked like clockwork, and workers on Main Street benefited from that quiet cooperation. But that balance has been shattered. Today, pride has replaced pragmatism. Diplomacy has been traded for insult. Strategy has been replaced by spectacle. And the result? A slow, grinding collapse that is eating away at the foundations of the US economy from the inside out. While Washington argues over who's to blame, the world is already moving on. Canada has found new markets in Europe and Asia. Mexico is negotiating fresh trade corridors. Even traditional allies like Japan and South Korea are quietly adjusting their strategies, no longer trusting Washington's word as final. It's a quiet isolation, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. The kind where the rest of the world stops waiting for America's approval. And yet, within this global reshuffling lies the harshest truth of all. Economic power isn't permanent. It's earned through humility, cooperation, and consistency. When those disappear, so does influence. Think of what's being lost. Generations of trust, decades of shared prosperity, the unspoken belief that America would always lead not because it had to, but because it knew how to. That era is fading, replaced by suspicion, resentment, and fatigue. Canada's quiet defiance isn't an act of rebellion. It's a reflection of something bigger. It's what happens when even your closest friends decide that your word no longer holds weight, when they no longer see partnership, only dominance. Veselti Chechene, and for the millions of Americans who will bear the cost of this arrogance, the tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way, because the story of power, real power, has never been about who can shout the loudest or threaten the most. It's about who can lead without breaking what they built. So, as the lights dim on Broadway, as border towns fall silent, and as the world's trust in America continues to erode, we are left with one haunting question. What happens when the nation that once defined leadership forgets what leadership means? That's the question every American must now face, not with anger, but with clarity, because arrogance may have written this chapter, but wisdom can still decide how the story ends. And as history has always shown, empires don't fall in a single moment of defeat. They collapse slowly, under the weight of their own pride.